Well, we are absolutely delighted to have Marc and Marco along with us to talk tonight. So, just going to introduce them both. Dr. Marc Bekoff, and I have trouble with this word, is a professor emeritus, see, there we go, of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado. Marc has published more than 1,000 papers, articles, scientific and popular essays, and he's written many books, and we will be talking about some of his books tonight. Marco Adda is also joining us. He's an independent researcher, anthrozoologist, educator, animal advocate, expert of dog behavior, and a real focus on free-ranging dogs. And we are absolutely excited and delighted to have you both here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's great. Great. So, shall I fire in then?
Get
Fire
started.
away.
Right. So I want to jump straight to Marc's latest book, Dogs Demystified. And I'm going to ask you, Marc, what motivated you to write this particular book, and what do you hope readers will gain from it?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm sure glad everyone's here, including Marco. I mean, I could talk for days on why I wrote it, but the basic reasons really were to have people become fluent in dog or dog literate, take seriously what it means to bring a dog into your home and hopefully into your heart, and to dispel myths about dogs. The most prevalent, although there's many out there, would be that dogs are our best friends and that they're unconditional lovers, neither of which is true, of course, or that dogs live in the present, and basically suggesting that their past experiences don't matter and that they don't anticipate the future. And another one, of course, is that all dog parks are bad and that it's not okay to hug a dog, which defies common sense, because I always say, if you and your dog like to go to the dog park, go. If your dog likes to go but you don't, maybe find somebody to take them. If you like to go and your dog doesn't like to go, go alone. And if you both don't like to go, then don't go. But really, what all those questions bear on is I've been thinking a lot about what I call the 3 C's of canid behavior, but say dog behavior, which would be consent, context, and choice or agency. And what that all boils down to really simply is that if we ask a dog to do something, they have to agree that they would like to do it. And if they don't, then we need to find ways, if you will, to get them to do what we would like them to do, even if it's for their safety, or even if they don't care about it. And just giving them as many freedoms or choices as we can, which is agency. And another big message of the book is that there's no universal dog. People forget that, around 25% of the billion or so dogs are home dogs, and a lot of studies focus on their behavior, and a lot are done in the lab. And Marco's work in Bali and other people studying free-ranging dogs is really critical, because we shouldn't be drawing conclusions about who dogs are or how they became domesticated by watching a handful of dogs in highly controlled situations. So there's lots of reasons, and it's organized the way it is. And I've really had a lot of emails about it, that people can go alphabetically. You can read it through, which some people did or have. But if you have a problem about barking or aggression or recognition or walking or whatever it is, you can go alphabetically, find the entry. And all the references are on my homepage. And we did that for a lot of different reasons, but it turns out people are writing me, they're thrilled. They can read the book, have their computer open, copy and paste a link into whatever browser they use, and there's the paper, rather than have to look through 150 pages of small and illegible type. So in my humble opinion, it's complete. Of course, there's some things that I couldn't cover, and it's accessible and it's easy to find the references. So I will stop there.
Fabulous. No, that's great. And it's lovely that it's, you know, it is accessible. So that, you know, it's accessible to anybody, isn't it? It's not just, or those who are really interested in dog behavior, but also, you know, just your average dog owner who just wants to know more about their dogs.
Yep. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really pleased that the comments I'm getting are really supportive, because I hate to say it because it sounds self-serving, but it was a hard book to write, because everybody was, you know, I had people read different sections, and trainers would say this and ethologists would say this. And of course, I excluded the behaviorists who think that dogs don't think and don't have feelings, because and in all honesty, I didn't feel like I needed to produce a balanced book. And I don't mean that lightly. I don't think we have to question whether dogs are conscious and sentient. They are. We don't have to question whether there are rules of social interaction that they follow, if you will. They do. So when people said, well, you're not considering the alternative hypothesis that dogs don't really have emotions, I'm going, you're right. Yeah. To me, that's not an alternative hypothesis anymore. To me, that's just, well, you fill in the blank with what I want to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is rubbish. I mean, you know, and I know Marco would agree, you know, we really need to learn more about dogs, who they are. Yeah. And it's a given. I mean, it's common sense that they're conscious and sentient and have deep emotions, and they're smart. You know, they're crafty. And I look at intelligence as being an adaptation that dogs, an individual dog has to adapt to different situations during their lifetime, and adaptable in terms of having, if you will, social and emotional intelligence. So another thing people go is, well, dogs don't really know what other dogs are thinking and feeling, which translates into having a theory of mind. Well, I think they do. But you're not going to find out these things in lab studies where you have such a highly controlled environment. You don't offer the dog the opportunity to express their dogness and their behavioral repertoire. And once again, that's why the studies of free-ranging and feral dogs are so important, because people will say, well, they're not very controlled. And of course, the counter argument is that the lab studies, and I've partaken in some, I've never done them really, they're so highly controlled. Either the dogs are bored because they can't tell you what they want to do or express their feelings, or they're so highly controlled, they don't have the opportunity to express themselves. So I'll stop there and let Marco chip in, and whoever else.
Yeah, please do, Marco. Give us your view.
Well, first and foremost, a huge thank to Marc for gifting us this other beautiful, wonderful book, much needed. We are all committed in improving the life of dogs and people, and we all know how much work there is still to do. And so this book brings another crucial contribution to the mission. And as Marc anticipated and said, you know, this book is really, it challenges clearly some preconceived ideas that we may have in general people may have, but also dog parents may have about dogs, which is the in my opinion, and I know you all agree on that, is one of those things that really doesn't allow, in most cases, for a relationship of an individual dog, or humans and dogs more in general, to advance, to move forward, right? We are sometimes so obsessed in trying to improve our life, and, you know, we do maybe yoga or mindfulness practice or other discovery trips or meditation, whatever may be, Everybody may have a different approach to improve his own or her own life. We want to improve our life. We want to somehow, let's allow me the term, elevate a little bit our life and try to stay better, to feel better, to feel more connected, to reconnect, to rediscover ourselves.
Mhm.
And then when we are in the presence of a dog, somehow all those people that in many cases are committed to discover themselves and do something to improve their lives, somehow all of that disappears, almost like there is no connection. So people have hard time in making the connection on how critical, how important is the presence of a dog, or how important may be the presence of a dog in our life, if we just allow for that dog to be what he is or what she is, or what he wants to be, right? So dogs are really a mirror, can be really a mirror for ourselves. And Marc reiterates that several times through the book, directly or indirectly, highlighting how they have improved our ability to feel, to be empathic, to understand life, right? So this is very crucial, is another important challenge, another important reminder that the book brings to us. And again, thank you, Marc, for that extra effort that you put in you know, these are the huge effort that you put into creating this volume.
Thank you. I appreciate your appreciation. And of course, your work has been so important anyway, in terms of making some of those points about individuality, the need to study dogs and let them express their dogness. I mean, let them be who they are. That's why many people say they get them, but they don't. They get them because they're control freaks, and dogs are easy to control. I mean, let's face it, you know, and you could do anything you want. But like I said before, when people say, well, I can do anything I want to my dog and they'll still love me, then no, you know, that's not so. You know, and another aspect of the individuality is that dogs are individuals, humans are individuals, and human-dog relationships are very unique. And people, you know, sometimes people will say to me, well, I had a golden retriever or an Australian shepherd or a mutt of a certain variety, and, you know, they passed on, or we could not keep them, and we got another dog of the same breed or mix, and they're different. And so all these stereotypes about dogs make them think that they're cloning a dog. And of course, cloning doesn't guarantee much on personality or temperament anyway. They just look alike if you do the right genetics. So what that does is it stresses the fact that what works in one human-dog relationship might not work in another, and that it stresses, once again, the individuality. And I mean, I've lived with many dogs. I know all of you have probably lived with and or interacted with far more dogs than I have. And that's what the beauty of it all is, that you can't make many general statements. Yeah, all dogs have 4 legs unless they're amputee, and they have 1 tail and 2 ears. But, you know, beyond that, and that's why context is so important, because context in a dog's life would be the nature of the relationship they have with other dogs and with other humans. And once again, when you study free running dogs at a dog park or free ranging dogs, a lot of what they do depends on where they are, who's around, human and or dog, how hungry they are they healthy, how do they feel, did they have a bad dream that night? I mean, and I think slowly but surely, because I'm a field worker, people are appreciating that really getting a handle on who dogs are is not as easy as just watching 10 dogs for an hour and then deciding that you have all the knowledge to come up with a theory of domestication.
Yeah.
True.
I think that one of the things for me working with dogs and their guardians on a daily basis, and usually the dogs that I'm seeing, it's the relationship has broken down a little. if there ever was a relationship in the beginning, because it might not have been that it's broken down, it might not exist, or it's a relationship based on transactions. So if we think about a transactional relationship where you do something for me and I will give you something in return, not in that let's live together and have that natural kind of organic relationship. But lots of relationships with dogs are transactional. If you do that thing, I will pay you with a reward, or I will praise you, or I will do this, that, and the next thing. And lots of training and behavior work has been around molding the dog's behavior to get what the human wants. Now, the problem with that is that that can never be a relationship that, and I'm not saying it's equal, there are no equal relationships either, there's always differences and it's fluid. But if you've set it up that I am going to mold your behavior and you will only get from me praise, treats, good stuff when you show me a behavior that I like, that I approve of, then it's not really a relationship that is going to grow and expand and flourish, is it? It's going to be, I have to, as a dog, I have to moderate my behavior and maybe even suppress behaviors, even though the person's not using punishment. I'm going to have to suppress my behaviors in order to please you and to gain maybe valuable resources to me. So it worries me when we talk about relationships and actually we're not really seeing a lot of that in normal groupings of people and dogs. What we're often seeing is this transactional relationship. And I think thinking about what makes a good relationship, and you know, if you were to treat a friend like that, I will only be nice to you and I will only support you as long as you are showing me behaviors that I approve of. And those behaviors could change weekly depending what mood I'm in. It doesn't really make for that lovely relationship where, you know, a dog is able to show their dogginess. And I know that we do have to have some boundaries and we have to have there's rules in society, isn't there? We can't all just go about doing as we please. But how far are lots of people willing to take that control and those boundary setting? Lots of dogs will never be able to make a decision, ever. Because decisions are made for them. Or they will look to their owner for, I suppose, agreement that they can do certain things. And so that, I think, is where some of that kind of, we were talking about sort of common sense, which I know is sometimes a difficult term to use, but we seem to have lost that ability to just accept dogs are dogs without having to mold them into maybe little versions of ourselves as well, and little super sociable individuals that we can take everywhere, and they're never going to embarrass us. You know, they'll never be naughty. They'll always be, you know, perfectly well behaved. And yet the human's behavior and all of that aim for perfection in their dog is way off a perfect base, isn't it? You know, so I think this idea of a relationship is probably one that needs to be looked at more closely. What do we mean by having a relationship with dogs?
Yeah. And not just basing on, well, they're man's best friend, so it's going to be a great relationship.
Yeah, right. Because I can do whatever I want and they'll love me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that it leads a little into a previous book that you wrote, Mark, as well, about, you know, a a dog's world, sort of imagining the lives of dogs if, you know, in the world if humans were not there.
Mm-hmm.
And just you had co-written that, I think, and what you were discussing there is like how well would dogs do without, you know, humans? And of course, if you ask a lot of dog owners and you say, how do you think your dog would do without you? Most of them say, oh, my dog could never survive without me. You know, my dog needs me.
Right.
And actually, it's maybe worthwhile if people haven't seen that book, maybe just kind of giving a wee bit of an outline of what your kind of opinion is of how dogs would survive without us.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there were lots of reasons we wrote the book, and we thought about it for a really long time, actually. It wasn't to say that we're not important. You know, a lot of people say, well, you know, that was your conclusion at the beginning. No, it really was a true question on how dogs would do, realizing that most people, and this is really interesting, by the way, because we didn't have time to develop it, but maybe I will someday, is that people who interact with free-ranging dogs or feral dogs, or, you know them, were not so strident about saying that dogs would do poorly without us. But, you know, if you have a dog living in a home, which could be a cage, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean, but they don't get to exercise choice and freedom. Everything is decided for them: when they eat, what they eat, where they eat, who they play with, when they play, when they pee, poop, and do all these things. So those dogs, you know, and this would be first generation dogs, of course, who had human contact, and then we all disappear somehow. You know, they would probably miss us. I think they would probably miss us less than free-ranging or feral dogs, but some free-ranging dogs get regular food, you know, by humans who are around. But I actually think, and I want to hear what Marco and others think, that when you give dogs the freedoms that to which they're entitled, really, but they're happier dogs when they get the freedoms, when they can consent, and I think they would do better. I mean, they just have a much more positive view of life, maybe. I mean, I'm not saying that a home dog in Manhattan, New York, doesn't have some good view of life, et cetera, but they just haven't practiced being a dog. They haven't had the practice of making decisions on their own. So the bottom line was, depending on a lot of things, some dogs would do better than others, but size wasn't really important. Hair, you know, coat color, coat texture, coat length weren't important. One of the most important things might be whether they have social and emotional intelligence and could fit in with other animals with whom they'd meet. Because once we're gone, the second generation dogs, it may be in their genes that they've got some inclination to be social, but they haven't had the experience with humans. As a side note, recently, some of you might know, I did an interview. I actually wrote a paper with Jonathan Lozos, who's a very famous evolutionary ecologist, who wrote a book. The American version is called The Cat's Meow. And we concluded that there probably would be few differences between cats and dogs in terms of how they did, because it's such a myth that cats aren't social. It's such a myth that they don't have certain social drives or capabilities to be on their own. But I think the bottom line for cats and dogs is that, once again, you need to look at the individual dog, what their personal experience is, what their personalities are, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. We've seen quite a few, I suppose, sort of versions of that with Chernobyl and Fukushima, haven't we? That when people have moved out of, or they've had to move out of areas that are highly radioactive, just about how the animals adapt, and they have managed to have a life there in spite of challenging conditions. And a lot of dogs were also left in these areas too. So I suppose we do have examples of things where people where there are highly populated areas, and then for whatever reason they've moved out, or they've had to move out, and having a look at how not only the environment manages to adapt and change, but how the animals within that go on to not only just survive, but can flourish. So, there's some really good examples of that. But
Chernobyl actually is not a great example, and I'm not meaning that as a criticism of you.
No, that's all right.
Turns out the dogs in Chernobyl had a lot of human contact after the radiation. The guards and the people who were around there fed them. Yeah, but I appreciate what you're saying, Dale, because it was a total change in their social environment. But that was one of the answers people gave, when we asked them. They'd say, well, look at Chernobyl. I mean, Fukushima and other areas might be an example, but there's a couple of people studying the dogs at Chernobyl right now, and I Zoomed with some of them. And I mean, a lot of these dogs, I know it sounds horrible to say, but a lot of the post-nuclear damaged dogs had better lives than they might have had before, because the guards really took them on and fed them.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, but there was a change, and and it was just a good just a really good example of the adaptive. It could have been a good example of the adaptability of dogs. But once again, the work on free-ranging dogs, even those that don't necessarily have predictable humans or predictable sources of food, they do pretty well. And do some of them suffer because of a lack of vet care or, general health treatment? Well, of course they do. But that's who dogs are today. They're not just dogs living in an apartment house.
Marco, you did some work. I remember, I think I did one of your courses, and what you talked about was this change in dogs who were free-ranging, free-roaming dogs, and the change in their behavior once they were adopted by families, or by individuals. And that kind of, I know we don't have the answer to that, but that might be something that's quite interesting to share with the group who haven't maybe, read about that or seen that. So do you want to talk a little about what your view on that is?
Yeah, shortly, what happens, and we may expect for that to happen when dogs shift their lifestyle from a free-ranging lifestyle to a companion, pet, let's say restricted dog. There are core elements that change into their life, not just the presence of humans, but also food is granted, affection, let's say in all the forms that may take, it's granted continuously, a sofa is granted. But conversely, roaming free is no longer granted. Mm-hmm. Choosing what type of proximity or distance you may want to have from other people, from other humans, is no longer granted. Choosing what type of distance or proximity you may want to have from other dogs is no longer granted. Choosing what type of meta communication you may want to use when you are encountering other free-ranging dogs is no longer granted, because now you may be living with some people at home, and when you go out from that home, you may be at a leash, because now you belong, let's say, to that family, and those people assume that they need to bring you outside of the leash. To determine to which extent you may or may not interact, you as a dog may or may not interact with other dogs or other people, right? And so there are many things happening in the life of the dog, in the environment of the dog, in the psychology of the dog, and therefore in the personality of the dog, and in the destiny of that dog, right? So those dogs, not necessarily those we have been studying in Bali, but we may speculate that happens in many type of situations. It may happen with dogs moving from a shelter to a house. It may happen with dogs taken from the street and shipped to another country to be adopted, and going through a very stressful process of being taken away from a street and put on a plane and being adopted. That there are parts of those, there are elements in that process that may be good, may be done with good intention, but in the life of that individual dog, everything dramatically changed. And so there are many things happening inevitably in the life of that dog. And I would put the focus mostly on the emotional life of the dog. And in fact, what happens is that what we have observed, for example, in Bali, is that those dogs being adopted become more reactive towards unfamiliar people, become more aggressive towards towards other dogs, or may become more, have a higher prey drive towards little animals, squirrels or lizard and so on, right? So they become, let's say, let's put it easily, they become less emotionally stable. They become way more reactive to certain contexts, to certain situations, right? Which is what we typically see also in companion dogs living at home with people. And I believe Marc also made that point, certainly throughout the previous book, A Dog's World, written with Jessica Pierce, and also in Dogs Demystified, right? How important it is for dogs to maintain their emotional balance.
Yeah.
And I believe in a world without humans, those dogs who have more emotional balance would have a higher possibility to survive, or anyway to cope with new circumstances.
Well, they always, right, Marco, that's excellent. They also wouldn't be continually being told no all the time. Don't do this. I mean, like kids, this weekend I posted something about why not use the word jelly rather than the word no. And Stan Coren, who studies dogs, wrote me, and he actually wrote a piece a few years ago where about a dog who thought his name was No. And it's funny on the one hand, but it's not funny on the other hand. And you're right, Marco, I think it's this constant being told, the helicoptering, I call it. It's being constant, 85% of the time of the 300 people I study, I think it's pretty robust, although, we could study more people, but 85% of the time the people were saying no, or stop doing that, or we don't do that. And I'm sure the dog is looking at them going, well, maybe you don't, but I do, because I'm a dog. And only 5% did the people just say, good dog, or like you say to another person, wow, you're really nice, or you do something to reflect the fact that they're nice, but they don't have to do something tangible to earn that reward, if you will. And I think Marco's point about the emotional balance is critical. I'm not sure, how unhappy some of these dogs are ultimately, because dogs like consistency. But my feeling is when I go to a dog park and people go, wow, they seem happier here, or wow, they seem freer here, which they are. And I don't mean it in a negative way, but the people are seeing who their dog is when they're allowed to just go run around and sniff and pee and play. The bottom line, of course, is making choices. You're granting them the freedom to be a dog, and you're granting them the freedom to be the individual dog who they are. Because, there's introverted dogs, there's extroverted dogs, there's dogs with, I wrote about bipolar and possibly autistic wild coyotes and wolves. When we studied coyotes for a year, you'd see the whole array, the whole spectrum of personalities and temperaments. Well, you see that in dogs as well. So I think Marco's point about the emotional balance which I think also frees up, if you will, the emotional intelligence. They can go out and try things. They get a read on something and they'll go, well, I'd really like to meet that gal over there, or I'd like to play with that dog over there. And they're allowed to make decisions and resolve the conflicts that occur, or they're allowed to make decisions and build on the relationship that they themselves sought out by not being told you can do this or that, or play with so-and-so, etc. You know the rest of the story.
Yeah, and they are allowed to make mistakes occasionally,
yes.
which is important. Is crucial to learn more about how to communicate and so on, right? And how to cope with every situation, which is tangible, so tangible when you observe free-ranging dogs, and is so clear that it's not necessarily the case when you happen to observe dogs living as restricted companion in a home, even when they go to the park, and there is still, in some cases, the constant presence of the human of that dog that still interferes with the behavior of that dog, with the choices that dog should or should not do, and with all the consequences.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that presence of humans, and what I did note down the word consistency, because that was interesting, mentioning about, you know, that dogs need consistency. But what I've always wondered is it just us that they need consistency from? Because they don't have a range of choice. They are more or less sort of trapped, you know, with us a lot of the time. And so when you rely on another person, another human, another being to provide for you, then it's much easier if that individual is consistent. But outside, if they had more choice and they were able to decide to go forward, to move away, would they need that same level of consistency, or would they be much more able to adapt and adjust to what was happening around them?
Yeah, I was going to say that the idea about consistency, and I would add clarity, they need to know. But following up on what Marco said and what you said is, I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, but, you know, it's important for young humans as well, or humans in general, to be able to resolve resolve conflicts on their own. So they don't always have this other, however dogs look at us, this other mammal, biped, you know, whoever we are to them, that you're not around to interfere and resolve their conflicts. So they don't learn how. And I think when you learn how to resolve conflicts on your own, you get to read different social situations, which makes you more adaptable. You know, you ultimately, as a dog and as a human, you know, there are certain situations all of us avoid. I wouldn't approach somebody who's a foot taller than me and start yelling at them and pushing them around. And dogs might learn the phenotypes of certain other dogs or humans and just avoid them. So that, but if they get involved, they'll know that there's certain ways to resolve the conflicts. And that's all part of, if you will, the social and emotional intelligence. And yeah, dogs sometimes fight with one another, but, you know, I always cite this one study. We did it on coyotes and we did it at a dog park, but we didn't have enough data to publish, that only 1% of all rough and tumble play fighting turns into serious aggression, maybe even less. The reason people make these ridiculous, wide-ranging conclusions about dog parks is because play is not as attention-grabbing as a growl or a fight. So I had somebody at a local dog park say, whenever I come here, the dogs are always fighting. So I said, well, how many times have you seen that? And he said, well, not a lot. And I said, but how many times have they played? I said, here's your homework. You come an hour, 5 days a week. Just make a little spreadsheet of how many times they play and how many times they fight. So he sort of did it. And I mean, I think playing versus fighting was about 1,000 to 1. I mean, literally. But people aren't fluent in dogs, so they mistake rough and tumble play or play fighting as being serious aggression. They step in and the dog goes, oh, well, that was easy. That human over there solved the problem. It gets back to what Jessica and I wrote about is, well, when dogs are on their own, they're going to have to form relationships, negotiate relationships, and resolve their own conflicts.
Yeah.
And they're not going to learn it as long as we, if you will, step in and intrude into their lives.
This is what we see in multi-dog households so often, isn't it? Where there's suddenly a problem and it's usually the human has tried to support one of the dogs, both of them, try and resolve it. Whereas a lot of the time, that's what's caused it. And the dogs never learn to cope with a little bit of, back chat from one of the other dogs. They don't learn to cope with that. It's because the human steps in.
Yeah, that's it. I hadn't thought about that, but that is, I mean, that's true. And among a lot of the people I know, and they're not doing it, I don't think they're doing it consciously. They may be, but I'm hardly want to step into that pot. But they may favor a dog, one dog over another. They might, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They might, for some reason, maybe one dog is more compliant, or one dog listens to them more, or one dog does what they say they want them to do all the time, just like people can be. And I don't mean that in any negative way, but I think what you're saying is right on the mark. And dogs are smart enough and emotional enough, if you will, to pick that favoritism out. I don't know. I honestly don't know how they cash it out in their brain, but they're saying something like they like Joe more or Mary more than me, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it, talking about emotions as well, and talking about Elisa's example of dogs really sort of trying to work out where everybody is in a household and what is allowed and what's not allowed. And I'm always really interested in, I don't think we should ever be having any more discussions about whether dogs feel emotion or not, or experience emotion. I think we've done that. I think we need to stop talking about that as though that's an earth-shattering, revelation. Anybody that's lived with a dog cannot fail to, experience that their dog is having some sort of emotion. And I always think it's funny about this discussion around jealousy and resource guarding. And I always use the example of, we have a saying, which is, I jealously guard my something or other. So we put those two words together when we want to keep something to us that's precious to us. And when we look after something very carefully because it's important to us, we jealously guard it. And yet the idea that dogs might experience jealousy seems to be quite a argumentative point. And actually, if you're stroking a dog and they're getting attention and the other dog comes over and nudges because they want attention too, okay, well, they're both, you've got something that I want, I'm going to come over. But you also get the dogs who will then growl at the other dog approaching to say, no, I've got the human, you don't. And so what people then say is that's just a form of resource guarding. But is it not just all terminology in the end? It means the same thing, doesn't it? Something that the dog really feels is important and wants to keep. So they're going to try and keep hold of it any way they can.
Yeah, I've said to people or asked people, if it isn't jealousy, what is it? And they can't answer it. But that's a great example, Dale, because a couple of years ago, a study was done doing fMRI on dogs' brains, and they created a situation where dogs where if people saw, another person getting food they wanted, they'd feel jealous. They created a situation, and the same part of the dog's brain in the amygdala lit up as in humans. Well, I mean, where else could you go? The one outstanding study, meaning not outstanding because it hasn't been done, but the one that we need is, do I think dogs feel guilt? I do. But Alexandra Horowitz published a paper in which she showed we weren't very good at reading guilt. She never said that dogs don't feel guilty. No. So I'm just tired of picking up the Times of London, the New York Times, New Scientist, Scientific American, you name it, saying so-and-so, based on Alex's great work, said that dogs don't feel guilt. And she's a good friend of mine, and people may not know that I actually trained her to watch videos when she was living in Colorado, and I was on her thesis committee. And it's frustrating to her, too, when they say, Alexandra Horowitz discovered that dogs don't feel guilt. Stanley Coren and other dog experts have said, and they're social animals. There's no reason to think that certain social emotions haven't evolved among, say, let's just say mammals now. Can birds get jealous? I'm sure they can, but I don't want to go there. Well, jealousy is really an important emotion for regulating social interactions. I'm sorry, guilt. Yeah, and stuff. And I remember this was years before maybe some of you were born, but I mean, when we studied wild coyotes, we used to have discussions about it all the time. I mean, you'd see, or wolves who are highly social, you'd see all these interactions indicating jealousy and guilt and all that, just behave ethologically. And I know that's something Marco's very sensitive to, is people have to watch dogs. I mean, that's why in the book, I'm always quick to say that a lot of the studies on captive dogs, they're really well done. The data are really robust, but they've done on a few dogs in a very specific location by very, different researchers, et cetera, et cetera. So are the results important? They are. Do we know how robust they are? No, we don't. And then people will say, well, what was done in one lab didn't agree with what was done in another lab. Well, that doesn't mean one study's bad and the other's good. It's just different dogs, different location, different context, different researchers. And I wrote about this, but having partaken, and people saying, oh my goodness, they're using food rewards. I was late today and I just fed my dog. Should I use them in the study? And I went, no, because they're using food reward. And even Jethro, my dog, who was a bottomless pit for food, at some point didn't want food. So if you were rewarding him in some ways using food. But I think that this is such a great discussion, because to me, once again, I was trying to capsule it when I wrote something a few weeks ago. It really comes down, there's another C: consistency, context, choice, for example, and consent. We try to grant these to humans. Let's grant them to dogs and cats, of course. I get it all the time, people saying, why don't you write about cats? You don't like them. And I go, no, I love them. I'm definitely allergic to most of them. But seriously, this is a really valuable discussion, because to me, it boils down to being a dog ethologist, if you will. When we study wild animals, even the birds I studied around my house in the foothills, everybody had to spend at least 20 hours watching the animals. No cameras, no iPhones. Well, they didn't exist then. Watch them. And it was the same when I did field work on coyotes. It's the same when I've worked on some of the wolf projects. Just sit and watch them. Nope, you don't record into the phone. Now you just watch them. And people, first they're bored, but after a while, they can't keep up. And I've done this with people here going to dog parks. At first they go, oh God, I have to watch them again. Within 2 days, they're fascinated by how much new they see every day. So Marco might comment on that, on the free-ranging dogs, of how variable they can be from minute to minute, by the way.
Oh, Marco, your microphone's off. Oh.
So,
Here we go.
Sure.
And I believe what Marc is saying, and following up with also what I've been saying before, this is a core focus, talking about people and how we may want to elaborate and come up with more ideas, more way to support people in expressing their needs and also developing their dog fluency, which is one of the core points of the book too. And by the way, this is the book here. Nobody's shown yet. So yeah.
Thank you. I got the Kindle version.
Yeah, and this is one of the core points that Marc makes throughout the book. How to develop this citizen ecology, right? Citizen science, and by growing, by expanding dog literacy, dogness, right? And how that may support for people to change their behavior and maybe influence other people to change the behavior, and so to create sort of, as I see, a contagious phenomena where all the community advances in understanding more and more dogs and in behaving otherwise and changing behavior. And I also want to recognize, acknowledge that many people, many dog parents, dog guardians are wonderful already. They're doing a huge effort in doing processes and programs and dog training programs and studying online and improving their behavior and changing their lives. So I want to acknowledge that. I'm sure we all acknowledge that, but there is still a lot of space for improvement. And also importantly, there is space to involve others and becoming an ambassador somehow of that process, right? And I believe that the book prompts that very clearly, and sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but it really comes with that built-in value that Marc fused into that book. And I believe this is one of the core points, and I'm sure Marc may want to say something more on this.
No, I mean, you hit it. You hit it right on the head. Even for a non-native English speaker.
I thought you were talking about me there.
Oh, no. I love Scottish accents. Unfortunately, every time I've been in northern Scotland, I don't even know if they're speaking English. But
it won't be.
No, I mean, you're right. And you know, I know we don't have that much more time, but to me, another really important aspect of this also is that the more we get to know dogs and for them to express their dogness, the more I think respect people will have that they're autonomous, if you will. You know what I mean? They're you know, that ties into whether, you know, non-human animals or persons, but without going there, you know, it's really that I honestly believe with people too, having worked with inmates a lot, is the more freedom they perceive they have, the happier they are. I mean, you can debate what happy and content means, but my dogs, when I lived in the mountains, they rarely were leashed. They almost never had collars on. I mean, they were open to other dogs. They knew how to resolve conflicts. You know, they knew how to tell other dogs they wanted to be with them or not. And the dogs who were also free, these were also free-ranging dogs who would come down to my house, knew how to read them. And they might go, well, I really want to be Jethro or Zeke's friends, but they don't really want to be my friend, so I'll go somewhere else. I mean, seriously, you know, and I think that and as life gets tough for people, I mean, the paper that we, you know, the four of us wrote, I mean, that's been really popular. It's gotten thousands of hits. And I've gotten some really nice emails about it saying, wow, we hadn't thought about the fact that if you will, stresses, and our discontent with life really rubs off on the dogs. And we're asking them to adapt to a fairly dysfunctional world often, or on a more grounded level, people who had dogs, they left them, they came home, they worked at home, or they got dogs during the pandemic and they spent a lot of time with the dogs. The dogs weren't simply accustomed, if you will, to being spoiled, although I don't think you can really spoil a dog. And then the people went back to work and the dogs felt abandoned and they had separation anxiety and stuff like that. So I think that more and more people are seeing that if you evaluate why you got if you got the dog to, if you evaluate why you got a dog, if you got them to control them, then there's something sick there and you might as well just admit to that. But if you really got them to be your companion and develop this mutual, long-lasting, reciprocal relationship, however you want to call it, but it's something positive, then you both benefit. And when you both benefit, life's easier for you and your dog. And the complaints I get, like I said, I'm not a dog trainer at all, but the complaints that I get were more like, my dog seems unhappy all the time. And my friend, who's a trainer in town, a very great positive force-free trainer, 99.9% of the time, it's because the people don't know dog, or they have no concept that their dog is as emotional and as impressionable as they really are. Yeah, yeah.
I think the article was really interesting, even for us to pull together, because I think it does prompt thinking about how are we adapting to the ever-changing world, and are we struggling to keep up with all that's expected in the it's not always a fast pace, is it? It's different, and what we might have to do today is very different from tomorrow. So I think as well, what made me think about it too was during the lockdown for the pandemic, I certainly worked very, very, very hard. And then all of a sudden I had to stop working because I could no longer see clients because we were locked down. We were not allowed to go anywhere or do anything much. And that forced change actually made lots of people, not just me, really think about, when we go back to whatever the new normal is, do I really want to go back to living that type of life where I'm so busy? Mm-hmm. And I think the interesting thing for me is that was something that none of us had any control over. It was enforced on us. And for some people, it was a dreadful, awful, I mean, obviously we know that people lost their lives and it was dreadful. And for some people, the isolation was absolutely horrendous, and so there wasn't this, oh, it's a lovely break, but it also forced that stopping and making us think about what we want to go back to. And actually, in some ways, I was lucky, I didn't get COVID, and so I was perfectly healthy, but I was able to then think about, well, what do I want my life to be like? But pre-COVID, I never questioned anything. I just worked. And I think that sometimes articles and accessible information is a smaller version of when we have a lockdown. It actually gets you to think about something that you're on that hamster wheel, aren't you? And why would you stop to think about it? It just is. That is the way that you live your life. So for lots of dog owners and dog guardians, they won't have thought about their dogs in terms of a possibility of a different life, because there's been nothing to prompt that thought. Why would you? You would just keep going. So I think that the more information that is out there that people can then read and then reflect on gives an opportunity to have that I really need to think about this now, rather than just this is life and this is how we live our lives with our dogs.
Yep.
So for me, that was the kind of important, I suppose, the sort of push towards thinking about that topic, is that humans are not adapting that well to all the changes and the fast pace. And yet we somehow think that dogs will just come along and, be able to adapt to whatever setting that we put them in. And that's not just if we take them to a dog park or we take them to a cafe. That's actually how we live our life. So the accepted normal, isn't it, is that your dog should be okay left alone while you go to work. That's an accepted norm, isn't it? Nobody ever says, there are some people that say, I'm not getting a dog because I work too long hours. But lots of people just say, well, I go to work, my dog's fine, they settle, and they're not unhappy. So these things are unquestioning as far as a lot of guardians and owners are concerned. They may not, there might not be a prompt to get them to think about it differently.
Yep, totally right. Yeah.
I think that brings us straight back round to your book, Mark, Dogs Demystified, because in many ways that could be the bridge, because it's accessible, to help dog guardians, owners, dog parents, whatever we want to call them, in gaining that knowledge and thinking about, like Dale was saying, lockdown caused us to think about stuff. Well, Dogs Demystified could be the bridge to that gap for dog owners as well, to get them actually thinking about, what does my dog like? What could I be? And start to make some of those changes.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. I mean, that's really, there's, like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of reasons, but it's forcing people, or not forcing, asking them to be introspective about themselves. The very basic question, why did you choose? Unless, somebody gave you a Christmas gift and you didn't want to say no. Why did you choose to bring a dog into your life? And I think more and more people are beginning to, at least among the people I know or write to me, it's a small percentage of people in the world, but, are beginning to say, well, can I really bring a dog into my life? It's a huge financial responsibility, a time investment, energy investment. Do I leave the house every morning at 7 and get home at 7 at night? Do I have anybody to care for, et cetera, et cetera? But I do think that the more that people appreciate dogs, once again, for who we know they are, sentient, feeling, conscious, emotional, intelligent, just fill in the blank beings, the more careful they'll be, because they'll realize they're not bringing like a pet rock or a robotic dog into their lives. And I think that people go, well, that's obvious. And then some of the people who say to me that's obvious, when I think of the life their dog have, I go, well, it ain't that obvious.
Clearly.
So anyway, thank you for that.
And I think too that the work that Marco's been doing about raising awareness about free-ranging dogs is, I asked some of my clients, just randomly, what do you think about dogs that don't actually belong to anyone, who are free to go, and they're, they maybe live in the streets, or they live, near people, or what do you think about that? And each and every one of them said, that's such a shame, isn't it, that they don't have a home and an owner. And I think you'll have something to say about that, Marco, because that's our belief, isn't it, that dogs need a home, the comforts, and they need the person caring for them. But maybe that's all we see that they need. And so looking at the free-ranging dogs and the restrictions that our dogs have gives a different view. So do you want to say something about the Marco?
Well, that comes down to the lack of dogness, and which includes also knowing that, as Mark also was mentioning before, that the majority of dogs in the world are free-ranging. And so average people may not know that, may not have that dogness notion, may have not studied that or bumped into that chapter where they learn from a book or from TV or from a dog trainer or from an online program that the majority of dogs are free-ranging. So they see the dog living with them as the universal way of having a dog in life, as the universal way a dog should live, right? So we need to debunk, we need to demystify, is the case to say, those preconceived ideas, and help somehow people in understanding that that's not necessarily the case. Is actually a minority. That dog living with that person is part of a minority, right? And of dogs worldwide, right? And and there are so many more things that we may say, right, about that. Like, for example, that same person may happen to believe that dogs in the street are dogs that have been abandoned. Well, in fact, it's not the case. Dogs, the 750 million dogs in the world who are free-ranging dogs are not abandoned dogs, are just dogs born free and living free and probably dying free if they're lucky enough to remain free. Because on the other side of the spectrum, you may have some organization with all the best intention may also in some cases take those dogs away from the street without understanding the value that the life of those dogs have in the street. I'm not talking about dogs that are injured or you know, in bad conditions. I'm talking about dogs that live free and have a value for that ecosystem, for that village, for that environment made of other humans, made of other animals, right? So there may be also organizations that act by leveraging that preconceived ideas, but leveraging that myth that dogs in the street have been abandoned. It's not necessarily the case, right? So there is a lot of work to do, for sure.
Yeah. I think that's an important message, isn't it? That we see dogs, domestic dogs in our homes. We see that as the normal because that is what we see, especially in the UK. It's quite unusual to see a dog out on its own. You know, if a dog is on their own walking about, you have concerns about that dog, you know. And Alison, I think it was, just put in the chat box there that, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, dogs went outside in the morning and came home at night, you know, that while their people were out at work, their dogs were out and about. Now, I'm not saying that that's correct to do nowadays, and obviously things are very different, and also there was lots of unplanned litters and, you know, there was lots of things going on. And life is different now to the 70s and 80s as well. But that was normal not that many years ago, that dogs were out on the street. And now it's very unusual to see a dog on its own. If you see a dog on its own in the street, you're thinking, what's wrong? Is that dog, you know, lost? So that shows out the way that we've changed our view on what is normal in terms of expectations of that dogs should be with people. If we see them, they're always with people.
Well, I mean, that's what people are being told when they're being told that they're our best friends and they need us and they're unconditional lovers. I didn't realize that change happened so rapidly, actually. But you know, in the mountains, when I lived in the mountains, it was really common to see dogs. Well, I mean, they had homes. Occasionally a dog would come through who didn't. But you know, to give, you know, once again, getting back to that theme, if you will, of freedom and acknowledging that they're socially intelligent and have emotional intelligence. I think COVID, too, getting back to that point, I had a bunch of emails from people, including a physics professor who would, you know, he he didn't leave his dog all day. He had a partner at home, they had kids, but he wrote to me and said that he was beginning to really appreciate who his dog is, because he was working at home. The university was closed, his lab was closed, and that he dreaded having to go back. And as it more into his lab, and it turned out that things worked out, so he does go back to work now. But the new appreciation he had from his dog means he'd come home every afternoon to see his dog, even though his wife and kids were home. I just thought that was great. and as a scientist, he had read my book, Canine Confidential, and the last chapter was an appendix of how to become an ethologist. And he was becoming an ethologist. Wow. He would collect some data and say, what do you think this means? And I love that kind of thing. And he would not have done that. I'm not saying that it was worth having COVID for that, of course, but at least he took advantage of a situation that was, if you will, unavoidable. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Wow.
Absolutely. And I think that on the point of choice, I know we're just about to finish, and we'll switch the recording soon, but I see a lot now, which is great, about people talking about choice and providing choice for their dogs. But my comment, and what I would kind of put out there as a plea, is giving a choice between two things isn't like a brilliant choice, because you might just be choosing the least offensive of two things. You might not actually be, if given the choice, you might not choose that one thing. So I think that this idea of, I'm glad that people are talking about giving choice to dogs, but I think we shouldn't rest on our laurels because we've offered two things to our dog and then said, I've given my dog choice, because that's not the same as actually being able to choose something that, or to do something, or choose something that you want. And I think that there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment. And I just want to bring that up, that you're not doing as good as we could do just by providing a choice between something or not. And the other thing is that a lot of the choices is either do it or don't do it. Yes. But there isn't the choice to do something else. Yeah. So that's a really important thing about us believing that we're providing choice.
I think my comment, I totally agree. My comment on that would be, given the limited choices or no choices some dogs have, that would work. But I was thinking about it when we were writing this jelly versus no paper, that even giving them a choice is something that's kind of unique, if you will. And giving them the option, if you will, and Mary, the trainer I work with, not to have to do something. You know what I mean? I understand. I mean, it's funny because when I lived in the mountains, all the dogs on the road, there were 5 houses, they'd walk down and I'd feed them all the time. And they would spend countless hours on my property looking for treats. These were big mountain-free dogs, and the treats would be like a marble. And they'd spend hours walking the area finding treats. And then, people said, well, dogs don't tell other animals where there's food. They don't share, all these myths. And I'd say, really, I see that almost every day. They'll bring back a treat and drop it in front of another dog, or they'll get another dog. I don't know how. Like, come on, Marco, let's do something. Come on, Lisa, let's do something. And the other dog will go off and look for treats with them. And then they would stop, because people would say, well, they excuse me, you're giving them treats and they're going to get bored and all that. They never got bored. And I wasn't randomizing the design of where the treats were in any intentional way. I just dropped them and buried them a bit by just randomly. The point there was, they made a choice. Did they want to do something? They didn't have to do it. They made a choice whether they want to share something. They made a choice of, did Jethro want to get Maddie to go, out for lunch with him and walk around the property? and I seriously, people who met these were among the most content dogs I've ever met in my life, because they knew that what they wanted to do or didn't want to do would be honored. And they were, the word that came up all the time for me earlier on was they didn't feel anxious. They didn't feel fear. They didn't feel any kind of, insecurity. They felt safe, that if they just said, nah, we don't really want to go look for food today, fine, then they're safe. And I excuse me, wouldn't be telling them they had to. So, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So I think we're nearly at the end. Marco, have you got any last words you want to add into our discussion before we finish off?
Well, just it was fantastic as always to share ideas, to elaborate a few points together and feel this joint, mission. And I believe it's important to gather time to time. And again, Marc, thank you for the wonderful book, Dog Demystified. And Lisa and Dale, thank you for setting up this conversation. It was fantastic. Thank you so much to all.
No, thank you both. I know you're both so busy that it's hard to fit everybody in, I'm sure, but we've really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do now is
I will do, when we finish recording this, I'm going to put up a slide with all the different links to, so Marc, to your books, so that they've got links of where, what books you've got, and to Marco, to your website, to both your websites, so that people can see. I'll just add on a slide or something to the recording, so all the information is there for anyone who wants to go and have a look. But
I was going to just say one thing, and I think what Marco just said is really important too. I mean, more and more people like these kinds of free-ranging discussions. I didn't mean free ranging, although I like that. No, I really mean that. I think that I've done a bunch of these motivated by the book to some extent, but in other circumstances, they just really like hearing people sort of let down their hair and talk about what needs to be done. People can go read the literature or not, to be honest with you. But I really do, because I mean, we covered countless topics here. I mean, I was taking notes and my handwriting's so bad, I stopped because I couldn't read what I wrote. But I think that for people to know, that people who know dog, and we all know a lot about dogs, to just be talking like this is really important, rather than being lectured and being told what to do. So I wanted to thank you for organizing this, because I think it's really the key to a better future for dogs.
I totally agree. I think that everyone having a discussion that ultimately is going to benefit dogs, but improve that relationship that we've got, or that we hope to have, must be a good thing. And I think that for many people, they're not interested in research papers, don't want to read a research paper. They want to just live a good life with their dog. And I think sometimes what happens is that people can get, a little bogged down in quoting studies and talking about something that maybe a lot of people can't relate to. And I think what you said at the beginning is really important, that, just because there were certain outcomes in a study, doesn't mean that it's easily relatable to real life. But we should take note of it, and we should be interested in it. But we should always be thinking about, well, there is information from dog guardians, people working with dogs, that actually could start to inform some of that research as well. So it should be a two-way thing. And I think that what we have to be careful is that, we're not waiting for science to tell us the obvious.
No, most people tell me they're waiting for, science to catch up with what we know. And I know they say that, but you're right. And the reason that I was going to say one more thing, which is kind of interesting, was one of the reasons the book is the way organized is for accessibility. I mean, you know, there's no references in the book. They can go to the website, like I said, look up a certain topic and click, you know, they can't click, they can copy and paste it. But I talked to somebody, and I think this was really important. It was really important to me, not to vindicate what we decided, but talk to somebody who's really an expert on unreferenced material, just book organization. And they said, when I was talking to them about putting the references on my website, not having another 130 pages in the book, and that is becoming it's hardly the norm, but it's becoming quite popular now. They said very few people will go to them. And I think they're right. They weren't saying that in a negative way, but people just, when Marco writes stuff, I trust him. I want people to trust me. I don't need to see a string of 47,000 references that dogs are sentient. And if they want them, they're there. But I think what we're doing conversationally, and this is what I meant before, is people want to hear what people who know about dogs, dog experts, think. They're not going to go read a detailed paper, the titles of which don't make sense. I mean, I've seen titles about dog behavior and I go, oh, you're actually looking at aggression in dogs, or you're actually looking at olfactory or smell preferences in dogs. I can't get that from the title. So I really encourage, not only hope we can do this again, but for people to just listen. Just listen. They're not going to go read all the research. And that's why it's incumbent on us to put forth what we know in a very clear manner. So I always say, so Joe and Mary Smith in Kansas, or maybe Joe and Mary Smith in Orkney, or wherever, or in Trento, can read it and understand it and know that they're getting the facts. I mean, know that from my own work, some people don't like my views on certain things, but they don't criticize my science. And I'm sure Marco's had that same experience. They're not saying you're wrong. It's just they don't like what we're doing because they feel threatened by it, if you will. No, well, I honestly believe that, you just go watch dogs. Hello? So anyway, I'll stop.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that where the greatest impact is ever going to be is with a person who lives with a dog. You potentially are going to be able to change things, or to at least get them to think about what their dog's needs are. And we do need that discussion to be out there, so that people do, they might pick up on one or two things and think that's really interesting. But it's got to be as though it's from a trusted source, hasn't it? And that's the problem why all of these eye-catching headlines that you see in the paper, don't hug your dog hates it. That's why they're popular, because it's a snappy headline. People see it and they go, oh, right, or they'll say that's a load of rubbish because my dog does like me hugging them and I don't care what you say. But at least they've thought about it.
Yep. I mean, that article that was, I think, in the New York Times or somewhere, that all dog parks are bad. That was the title. Basically all. Well, it's like saying dogs are our best friends or unconditional lovers. It sells books, it sells magazines, but they're all lies. Or that dogs are zen, and we should emulate dogs and get life lessons from them because they live in the present. No, they don't. Anyway, I'll stop. We probably got it.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing that people will say to me, the dogs live in they live in the present, and they don't have memories. Lots of people say that. So I know, it's bizarre. I'm going to mute myself because my dogs have got a memory of somebody coming to the front door and are going to bark. I'll mute it.
No, but we really appreciate. We know how busy you both are. Really appreciate you just making this possible tonight. Has been absolutely brilliant.
You. No, this is great. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording